we had the Normans come in, and my mum found out we're related to William the Conqueror. So
Really?
yeah, she's real nut for family history. And once you get into the one royal family somewhere, it pretty much just goes all the way back. And so we had him come through with was it a French kind of French language? Was it a Norman French language that came in?
I think it's people sort of refer to Anglo-Norman as the kind of blending of the two, but I think it's like any situations where they actually blended is quite marginal. I think most people just spoke English, and slowly French vocabulary started kind of diffusing downwards, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, because we've got obviously French. I mean, English is something like 70% French vocab now, but it has a German understructure, and the most frequent words tend to stay. They're all Germanic. I think the first 200. So we had that happen, and then I think it just became modern English throughout the 1500s, 1600s is when they had the Great Vowel Shift, and it changed.
Yeah, that was sort of the 1500s. Yeah.
The stuff I was really interested in getting you to chat about was, what would life have been like during, say, Danelaw, where we had all of these Norsemen coming over, repeatedly immigrating to Great Britain? What would have been the cultural setup with different languages, and how would that have blended to make Middle English?
That's a really interesting one. That's actually something I've looked a fair bit at because of the northern kind of dialect that my grandparents speak. I kind of got interested in that kind of Danelaw thing through that, and sort of north and eastern England thing. And I personally think that in, say, probably the 900s, there would have been a lot of bilingualism about, because I think the only way you can get, so for instance, in standard English, there are a huge amount of Old Norse loanwords in the core vocabulary where there aren't many French loanwords, as you say, and the most common words are mostly Old English, but then also Old Norse. So words like egg and skull and skirt and things like that are all Old Norse loanwords. And in northern dialects, you find more Old Norse loanwords. You find a huge proportion of core vocabulary is Old Norse, and there have been various analyses, most of them done sort of in the late 1800s, trying to work out if there's any kind of pattern. So, for example, if Old Norse words were used for agricultural things, or if Old Norse words were used for landscape things, stuff like that. I can't remember exactly what they found, but I think to have that level of diffusion of Old Norse vocabulary into the core vocabulary of people, you really need like widespread bilingualism. Like not necessarily everyone was bilingual, but people were sort of marrying into families that spoke the other language and things like that, because you have even prepositions in the north of England and in the east of England in Middle English, but not so much in early modern English. You have prepositions like till, which is like the Scandinavian preposition meaning to, as in to go to somewhere. You have the infinitive marker at, which is it's been reduced in a lot of Scandinavian languages. I think in Icelandic is now ad, but it's like the infinitive marker. So
it's the equivalent of to, yeah.
Yeah, but they're both kind of the equivalent of to in different circumstances. But you have those words in some Northern English dialects into the 20th century, and have them in writing well throughout the Middle English period and throughout the early modern English period. And to have that level of inclusion of that kind of vocabulary, I think you would have had to have had families that were bilingual, families that were teaching their children both languages.
Well, and that's what you would expect, right? That would be the most natural thing. It seems like it's sort of the null hypothesis, if you were to go about it scientifically, would be you would have two different groups here. If they're mixing and they're living in the same areas, you would imagine there's going to be some level of bilingualism. It would be,
absolutely.
I mean, it probably makes more sense for the null hypothesis to really be there's no difference and they both keep separate. But you would imagine that's the more sensical thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like there are people who think that there wasn't actually much actual Scandinavian presence and that it was mostly just landowners and things like that. But I think there must have been. I mean, there's genetic evidence. I think there was quite widespread Scandinavian actual presence of people like immigrants. I think there's some evidence that the animal husbandry practices changed after the Scandinavians arrived. So there were more pigs, there was more fishing, there were more waterfowl and things like that, poultry in general.
That's interesting that there's a big cultural push as well, then, which may have ramifications to the language itself as well and how it's used.
Yeah. Like what was I going to say? That it's weird because there's not really, aside from sites where Scandinavian sort of armies and things camped, there isn't much. It's quite hard to differentiate Anglo-Scandinavian people, like ordinary people, from Anglo-Saxons in the archaeological record, even though there must have been lots of people who spoke Old Norse. The archaeology identifying them as Scandinavian pretty much disappears within 1 or 2 generations. So there are very few sites that are very clearly, these are just Scandinavian people who live in England.
I always find that funny with movies, right? Where you watch the movies and TV shows about Vikings, and they're always like, "How do you know which ones are which? Oh, the Vikings are the ones with chainmail and leather and the helmets, and the Anglo-Saxons are the boring-looking ones," or something. And you're like,
"Yeah, they're always the boring-looking ones."
I have a feeling they would have all looked the same, like maybe
colored. Like within, I mean, I suppose in terms of like things like hairstyles, I think there's some evidence, literary evidence, that there were sort of typically Scandinavian hairstyles that were worn by royals and things like that were sort of recognized as Scandinavian influence, but those things don't really preserve in archaeology. So things like Scandinavian motifs on tools and things, you don't really get that in the archaeology, because once a tool wears out, you just get a new one from whoever makes them nearby, and those people are, and I think that's more evidence for the kind of the quite rapid diffusion of Scandinavian communities into the wider Anglo-Saxon community, rather than the isolated Scandinavian communities. And I think even from a practical point of view, like particularly upland places like the Yorkshire Dales and the Lake District and places like that, nowadays land management and agricultural management in those places is a very locally managed thing. And from place name evidence, you can sort of tell that Scandinavian communities, or rather places named in a Scandinavian way, were very, very close to places named in Old English. So there was clearly, they would have had to have some level of cooperation.
Well, and if they're farmers, right, you can imagine they're going to be trading with one another. They're probably going to be marrying one another. They're going to be raising children that, speak different languages, have friends in different languages, etc.
Yeah.
But what was the main difference for the adoption of a great deal of Norse language, but not in terms of Celtic language? Because I think you covered that in one of your videos. Saying that,
like the lack of inclusion of Celtic. I've always considered doing a video on it, but Langfocus did a decent video on it quite a while ago. But it's it's like there's clearly, from genetic evidence tells us that there was clearly, it wasn't just a population replacement when the Anglo-Saxons arrived.
Yeah.
So why is there so little Celtic influence on English? Like there are very, very few loan words from Celtic languages into English, even in sort of fringe dialects, like, dialects in sort of Scotland and Northern England that you would expect to have a load of Celtic vocabulary, because that's where Celtic populations were sort of interacting with English-speaking populations the longest, but they don't. And I don't know why. Like there are certain grammatical constructions that people have linked to maybe Celtic substrate kind of influence. So a load of Celtic language speakers learning Old English, and then them kind of
taking the grammar that they know in one language, which is what I would do in Portuguese. If I'm unsure, I'm just going to use English grammar and then see, does that work?
See if it works, yeah. And if entire communities are doing that, of course, then it becomes the standard.
Yeah.
So, but then those constructions tend to appear quite late on in writing, and some people, so like 1500s, 1600s, when really by all rights there should be no one speaking, as far as we know, there should be no one speaking Brittonic anymore anywhere, apart from like
France,
Welsh
right?
speakers. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy because I think I looked up some of these words. I think we've got Scottish Gaelic can, which is why we call the place Cairns up in the north of Australia, right? It's like
Oh, right,
a
okay.
burn, I think you would say too. A burn's probably a word that we get from them where it's like a kind of
Yeah,
like a sand dune or a hill, right? And then
yeah,
trousers, claymore, bog, galore, shindig, slogan, spunk, whiskey. And then Irish
yeah,
Gaelic ones like banshee, gob, as in mouth, and then hooligan
yeah,
and limerick and leprechaun, slew, slob, and smithereens. I was like,
yeah.
okay, so we do have
I like
some,
those.
but
Yeah, there's like a smattering, but it's not generally the words you'd use. It's a really weird collection of words because it's like
mhm.
it's not prestige words, like it's not words to do with royalty or government or anything like that. But it's not words that I would use a lot. But I don't know, like
You just
they
know
seem
them.
like full vocabulary words. Yeah, like they seem like words you'd use on an everyday basis, but they're just not. I don't really know how to characterize them really.
Oh, and then we had the invasion of William the Conqueror in 1066, where he's brought over. I guess it's sort of an archaic version of French today, and
Mm.
that's where we get the majority, I would imagine, of our French loan words, especially the ones that are
Yeah,
spelt differently. But you're like what's a
yeah,
good example?
yeah,
Probably, as opposed to the French probablement. You know
yeah,
that
yeah,
it's spelt differently, so I can see. Okay, and like any of those words, like confiscate in French is probably something like confisqué or something like where they've
yeah,
added a
yeah,
t to the end or removed it. But so
yeah.
what happened then once William the Conqueror came over? How did that affect English, and how did the French enter English? Because it was a different process, right? Because all of a sudden you had the upper class with that language as opposed to the lower or middle class farmers that were the Scandinavian speakers blending the languages together.
Yeah, I think I don't know much about the exact process that it happened, but I could only guess that it was sort of, successively lower kind of class people picking up the language, picking up the French because they wanted to sort of, you know,
Emulate the
appear higher
rich.
class. Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
I
Yeah,
think we got it for things like the church, government, law, royalty, food, and that's why in English we have you
beef
have
and
what, yeah,
cattle.
beef and
Yeah,
cows. You'll have different words for the animals, but the meat's a different word. It's a French word because it tended to
yeah,
be
yeah,
that was how the royalty or the rich people interacted with those animals. It was they were dead and on the plate.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. That's part of the thing that people. I think I said that people were trying to analyze the Scandinavian element in certain dialects and whether it was land use or whether it was, and I think that was based on the idea that the French loanwords that we have tend to be to do with certain aspects of life. So as you say, like eating meat or government or royalty or things like that. Although of course there are French words in the core vocabulary, like people I think people is a French word, or a French derived word. I could be wrong actually, but I
I
think
think
it
it
is.
is. You would say purple, but you would say it for people as in a people, and you would
Right.
say for for
Okay.
like hey people, it would be gens. I think more so
Oh,
than
okay.
peuple. Peuple would be like the group of people.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's the only French loanword I'm aware of that's extremely everyday. But no, there's bound to be more than that. But yeah, no, I assume it was just like diffusion from the upper classes to the lower classes,
And
and then
so
after that, it's just sorry.
no, you get. Well, I was going to say, what's the next step then to get to modern English? So we've come through where the French came in, and we had 500 or so years of Middle English, and then we have what the sort of great vowel shift is the marker where
Yeah,
we suddenly get into modern English, and that's sort of is that where Shakespeare was writing right at that? Was he speaking Middle English or
yeah,
modern English?
modern English, like
Yeah, okay, so it's just afterwards, is it?
just after the Great Vowel Shift. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the Great Vowel Shift probably happened. Well, it definitely happened in different ways in different places. So there was a different kind of Great Vowel Shift in the south than in the north of England. And then at the point Shakespeare was writing, I think you could probably take a sort of West Country dialect from 100 years ago and compare it with if you had a recording of someone speaking in the early 1600s, you'd probably it'd be a toss up. Like they'd be so not similar, but one wouldn't be obviously older than the other. Like I think beyond that point, it's just a kind of diversification into the English dialects we have today, and there's not much kind of linear progression as much as there is diversification after that point from our perspective. I mean, there's always been diversification, but from our perspective in writing, because we've only really seen the sort of formal standard, it's been more of a linear progression. But at that point, it's just like, I mean, that's kind of the point that American English starts to split off. And then, of course, later on, like late 1700s, early 1800s, you have Australian English splitting off, which is interesting because, like, there are some recordings of people speaking their regional dialects from, I think, the 1910s, which I could send you some of to link in the description or something if you wanted. And that, like, I listened to ones from sort of there were none from, I couldn't find any from London. There probably were some from London, but the ones from the southeastern coast of England, like sort of Essex and Norfolk area, they sounded remarkably Australian to me, like in terms of vowel qualities and things like that. And I think like early, not linguists, but early people writing on the dialects of Australia in sort of the 1820s, 1830s actually commented that they'd started to diversify. By that point, they'd started to diverge from British English, but they had a clearly significant London element. So I think,
well, it's an interesting story. A really good book that's worth getting that you might like is the Story of Australian English. I don't know if you've seen that one.
So I've not seen that one.
He talks about how it got here. So, you have the middle / upper class gentry who are the ones bringing the convicts out here. The people like Arthur Phillip, who was the first governor of New South Wales, and all of his soldiers. But then the majority of them tend to be obviously convicts, most of which I believe were Cockney. So they were from southeast England, around London and those areas, Devon and everything else. And they were the lower class, so they would have had the Cockney English that they spoke, as well as flash language that they talk about, which is the sort of thieves' language, all the slang that they used that was related to stealing and the underworld, effectively, that they brought over. And then you also have a whole bunch of Irish, a whole bunch of Americans, and I think you even had 12 African descent convicts that were brought over. And so there's this huge mix. And I was looking into it and just thinking, how amazing must it have been the first generation of quote unquote Australians, at least European Australians that got here, and watching them develop their own dialect of English, because you literally have, a small population of, I think, about 2,000 people in a very small area, and they all speak with different accents, or at least all the adults that were brought there later in life, and the kids have to kind of work out, we're all the next generation. Well, we're all born. We're all, and you know what kids are like at schools, right? You end up with your own slang words, your own jokes. The in-group is usually the children. They blend with their parents a little bit, and they get a bit of influence, I would imagine, language-wise. But I would say that the majority of the way in which I speak is probably a result of my peer group at school, at university, than it is my parents per se. And so imagine how much that first generation especially would have really changed.
Yeah, it must. Like, I think that's the thing is, because it really surprised me to read the thing about people noticing by the 1820s that there had already started to be a divergent. But it makes sense, because a lot of the time where you get a lot of linguistic diversity, that happens because there are people of so many different language varieties meeting each other. I think multicultural London English is a good example of a similar thing, where people from lots of different speech communities meet, and among the younger generation who sort of all go to school together and mix together, you get this dialect produced where you can't even tell what comes from where. Like, you can't tell which bit comes from which original language variety, but there's clearly influence from all of them. And I imagine it being something like that, like the dialect 2 or 3 generations down the line must have been something very, very interesting.
Well, the thing that I found interesting is that I think there's a linguistic process called leveling, where all the extremes of the different dialects and languages get sort of pushed out, and they disappear, and they kind of converge on a sort of center around which, it's just the most common sounds, I guess you would have, like if you have one Scottish person and the other 100 are from some obscure town in England, you would imagine that their children are not going to sound like Scots.
yeah, absolutely. I think the same thing happened in Old English, like when all the continental dialects came over, there seems to have been a leveling, and then the dialects diversified from there. But what were you saying? Sorry.
Well, the interesting thing I think with Australia and the dialect and how it developed is that you would have had all these people in very, very small colonies, at least in the first 50 years or so. And yet you would have had a constant stream of new people coming in almost on a yearly basis.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why you'll have this interesting outsider perspective on Australia in history, because you'll have all these British people coming over, whether they're convicts themselves or they're landowners and free settlers that are educated and were writing diaries and stuff, that could note on, holy crap, we were out here 20 years ago or something and it was completely different, or we were told that it was something different. Yeah, and that must have been changing so quickly. But one thing that I don't know how much you know about, but I would love to know more about why slang is such a big thing in Australian culture than, say, American or Canadian. I think it's a big thing in British culture, so it's probably tied there to some degree. But I know that...
I would say, from my experience, it's more of a thing in Australian culture.
Yeah.
But then I don't know about every aspect of British culture, but like I've experienced a lot more with Australians, like on digs and things, than I have with British people. And it's a massively interesting thing. You talked about and this is just me sort of guessing, I've got no idea, but you talked about the kind of thieves language, and the culture of kind of having ever-changing slang it might stem from something like that, like a sort of a need to have a kind of common language that the in-group understands and the out-group doesn't understand, a kind of deliberate...
Yeah. You'll notice Australians do that. Australians will put on the accent a bit more, and they probably end up using slang more. You're going to hear people, as soon as I get to America or something, you're probably going to hear me say, "G'day, how's it going?" a lot more than I would here, because it's kind of like, "Hey, I'm different. Know where I'm from. Any other Australians out there?" Like,
like a sign of sort of beacon.